Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelou, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a collaborative campaigning community that operates internationally. Our purpose is to promote ongoing reform of the financial services sector so that it serves society better. We go about our work in many different ways. One of the most enjoyable things that we do is bring like-minded people together. We do that in various different ways, including through the session we've got starting now, one of our book club sessions. We're going to be focusing on the topic of culture audit in financial services as a direct consequence of the wonderful book that Mr. Roger Miles has written. That's going to be the theme for the night. We're going to invite each of our attendees, first of all, to briefly introduce themselves and comment as succinctly as they can on why the topic of culture in financial services is of some interest to them. So if I can go to Mr. Nigel Cairns, first of all, please, to introduce himself and talk about why culture in financial services matters to him. Nigel.
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name's Nigel Cairns. I'm living in Devon, and I've been involved in a very long-running banking dispute that I think has culture at the heart of the dispute. It's a regulatory issue, but I think the conduct of the particular bank that I'm in conflict with has developed, and I've seen many facets, poor facets of behaviour, all emanating from, I think, very bad, deep-seated culture. So that's why I'm interested.
Nigel, thank you very much indeed. We go from Nigel Cairns to Mr. Dennis O'Connor. Dennis, tell us a bit about yourself and why this topic's of interest to you.
I'm a chartered accountant. I've worked in wholesale banking for 30 odd years, now retired, spent on the compliance side. In my career, I just saw repeated examples of poor culture. Don't care about the client, let's make money. And it's the heart of a lot of problems I see in banking.
Thank you for your candour and your honesty, Dennis. Really great to hear that. We go to Kim Schweitzer.
Hi there, I'm Kim Schweitzer, founder of Time for Change London, working with organizations that actually genuinely believe people, planet, and profit are all important in creating a great company culture, but don't have time, energy, or expertise to focus on the people part. And the reason that I'm here is because I truly believe in what TTF is doing in terms of promoting ongoing reform in the financial services sector. And for me, that starts with the heart of culture.
Kim, very, very well put. Thank you so much. And last but by no means least, to Mr. Stephen Scott.
I'm Steve Scott. I run a what's known as a RegTech or regulatory technology company in the US called Starling. We have achieved something in the way of some notoriety internationally for challenging banks on how they manage culture and conduct related risks. So it's a topic near and dear to my heart. And I'm here today because Roger is my role model and I would never miss an opportunity to learn more.
Wow, you've set that up so nicely, so smoothly, Stephen.
Stephen, I was going to say the same thing about you.
We go from the smooth Stephen Scott straight to Roger Miles. Roger, please give us your background. Tell us about the book and get things moving.
Talking culture, full disclosure and transparency, since this is a transparency forum, Stephen and I know each other well. We have co-authored, not least on some of the contents of the book that I'm about to introduce you to. So he has some inside knowledge of what we're about to discuss. Just briefly, me, trained as an accountant, practiced in investor relations, then worked in government for a while with various lobby groups and ministerial offices on risk communication. Retrained as a cognitive psychologist in the noughties, and since qualifying and getting my doctorate, a number of things. We've had a global financial crisis. I've specialized in regulatory design, particularly talking to financial regulators all around the world. Some of these regulators, as we're about to see, are intelligently applying the science. A lot of them are can we say this, Stephen? Unintelligently applying the science. And that's why I felt it might be useful to write this book, which is, although strangely, a number of the regulators have rushed forward to endorse the book, which is quite gratifying, it is actually quite a fierce critique of conduct regulation. And there are at least 2 chapters which really don't pull their punches, saying, look, the conduct experiment has failed, we need new tools. And that's partly why I felt I could step up and offer my 2 pence worth and say, well, here are some new tools. Going in the same direction as what a lot of these conduct regulators are talking about, this thing called culture assessment. Very glad that everyone on the call this evening is interested in culture assessment for various reasons. I am going to talk a little bit about the technical stuff, but I'm going to try and skate as briefly as I can through that and stick to the more policy stuff around what do we need to do to shape these regulators, get them to either use the science properly or stop claiming they are and actually do something. So let's see if I can get us to that state over the next 30 minutes or so. There's quite a lot of information here, quite a lot of graphics I'm just going to pop up on the screen as flashcards for the simple reason of saying, look, here is the science that they're drawing on or possibly not using. I don't set myself up to be a global expert critic on this. There are many people in academia who have more depth of knowledge. I think I am, though, perhaps one of a small handful of people who mediate between the science and the practice, and I'm fairly direct and hopefully outspoken in terms of how this should be done better. There's a lot of guff that comes out of the regulators about this. I'd like to see it as part of my role to call their bluff on that. So Andy, shall we push the slides and crank it up? By the way, I do try and make sure that I am as plain speaking as possible. So if I start talking jargon and gibberish, do call me out on it. I'm very happy to be stopped at any point. In the natural way of things, we'll try and gather questions at the end, but we're a relatively small group. So do please, if you think that what I've just said is utter nonsense, wouldn't be the first time, jump in. Or perhaps, Andy, you prefer people to put a hand up and you call them out. Is that a better traffic management system?
Yes, please. That would work perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Brief overview. Why did we put this group together? So a group of 10 of us, actually in the end 11 of us, who are active in places like LinkedIn and sector conferences. Most of us know each other, felt that it might be a good idea to write a bit of a counterblast against this regulatory orthodoxy that behavioral science is all working wonderfully to effect change. We think it isn't, actually. There's some really useful stuff they could be doing, but they're not. So we called out this thing called culture audit, which is a phrase that's very topical with regulators, as we'll see, and drew on conversations with regulators on 3 continents. So just to be clear, that's the Americas, Europe, and the Far East. There are conduct regulators all around the world. We might get into that in the topic in the discussion. Bizarrely, the FCA has endorsed this book, even though it's quite critical. And it's 11 expert co-authors. All of us have had some hand in regulatory design, either working with government, working with regulators, or working as heads of compliance or conduct embedding on the banking side, or in some cases, all 3 of those kinds of roles. I'd like to talk a bit over the next half an hour or so about a bit of context. This idea of redefining conduct not as an infraction, but as possibly you've got a haze of misconduct, abusive behaviors, and then on the other side, something called exemplary conduct and purposeful culture, stuff that we're trying to draw firms towards. So this is not all negative, not all about punishment. Some of it should be about positives. Some better questions which might lead the debate forward and actually get better engagement between regulators and businesses. A couple of short examples of that. And then I hope enough time for maybe 10, 15 minutes worth of Q&A, depending on how hungry people are at the end of the session. If you want it all in 20 seconds, I'm a great believer in the summary. Conduct-focused regulators have noticed a read across between weak culture and incidental misconduct. So things like discrimination, abusive behavior, acting like a jerk, as one of my research respondents put it. you know, we all know what that kind of misconduct looks like, and it's perfectly fair for regulators to say, can we map those sort of incidental misbehaviors into the more serious stuff about crime, mis-selling, and so on. I think that's a good starting point. I like that they're using behavior observation, and it holds out the prospect of predictive analytics. So anticipating misconduct before it gets serious and taking a wide culture audit view of the firm as part of that. It does require new techniques and a whole new set of indicators that the classic audit profession hasn't really got its head around. So I am convinced, along with Stephen and others of us on the panel, that this approach could work, but I'm not convinced that it is working, and hence this manifesto. So quick contents, obviously you can see this online as well. The book covers things like defining better behavior, this thing called behavior at risk, as opposed to the old econometric value at risk indicator, non-financial misconduct. We define 200 key terms around the psychology and risk analysis. We refer to 300 external sources. The rest of this you'd pretty much expect in a book about culture analysis in particularly banking. What's the new information, the new sources of reporting, what kind of culture crisis are regulators themselves having? You might remember the FCA's notorious memo about the state of its own toilet facilities, possibly as a proxy for the rottenness of its own culture. More importantly, people reading this, and it's a hefty book, it's 350 pages, so people reading this really do want to say, show us example analytics, show us stuff that works. So we brought in a pretty heavy panel of expert scientists who do full-time behavior analysis, not necessarily in finance, by the way. We've borrowed someone from aviation and somebody else who's formally qualified in the sort of HR, organizational behavior, as well as our own set. So finally, I risk suggesting that there's a better way ahead if we do this stuff better. So let's start with a quick recap over what I call the conduct project of regulation post-global financial crisis. It's actually not post-global financial crisis. It goes back a long way further. When I ask in classes, so who can name the world's first conduct regulator or behavior-based regulator in finance, most people say the FCA. It's not. It's actually the Dutch central bank, closely followed by Japan's Securities Authority and the South African central bank. So they got there well before the rest, and certainly before the financial crisis in at least one case. Along came a bunch of others post-GFC, including our own FCA and PRA. Now, of course, everybody's doing it. South Africa and Hong Kong are onto their second iteration of conduct regulation already, and. You'll be familiar with this, you know, it rolls out through subsectors. This is just the UK example. It started with banking, went through insurance, and now it's pretty much everybody else. Kind of things they were interested in: customer, you know, fair treatment of customers, senior manager accountability, and now this thing called culture audit, which crucially goes to all staff. It's not just senior managers, it's bottom up as much as top down. I think that is an entirely good development, but clearly it creates challenges, not least for regulatory resourcing. So we're seeing this in culture assessment. Also, by the way, if you're not aware of this, reputation risk capital charges are just around the corner. I think that's going to be a fabulous instrument for, as somebody said in the intro, beating the big investment banks over the head with a stick. I think there's nothing like a good dose of capital charges to get people to pay more attention to this stuff. There are regulatory treaties in place. This is just the example of the treaty between Japan and the UK on knowledge sharing in the culture assessment space. I could quote probably 17 others, but time precludes it. Dutch Central Bank, here's a good helicopter view of where the project is heading generally. So this is pre-financial crash, looking at where are we looking for signs of problems. Hey, guess what? It's all econometric. This is post-crash, and in particular now getting into the 2020s. Hey, look, behavior and culture, board effectiveness, thematic, you know, culture-based questions around are you engaging with really caring about customers and society more widely. I'd sum this up really just with two little overlay graphics. If the old regulation was about driving in the rear view mirror using these sort of econometric analyses, the modern stuff is about what's going on in people's heads How do teams relate? What is human interaction like? And what human risk pressure points come out of that? Now, Regular, again, you know this bit, so we can flash over it fairly quickly. They've noted there's a read across between these types of misconduct, what we, again, might just label behaving like a jerk, which include, by the way, not having any conversation about how we behave. So suppressing discussion about behavior is itself a very powerful red flag for misbehavior. You can then reverse map that back onto the old stuff of, you know, mis-selling, financial misconduct, overtrading, and that, all the stuff that we're historically familiar with. I'm not actually going to run through this whole slide. This is a piece I delivered at the Money Laundering Conference at Cambridge last week, but just to give you a sense of the direction of travel. So we're moving beyond simply defining misconduct, infractions, and enforcement risks towards hanging all of this on purposeful culture. So good that we've got ESG people on the call. So Kim, I don't know, this kind of resonates with you. You're still on the call, though I can't see you on the screen. Attaching purpose to incentives and purpose to good behavior and mapping that, rather than the conversation being entirely about the event of misconduct. It's more important, surely, to pull people towards what the regulators call exemplary behavior and not necessarily always be calling out just the bad stuff. We've grown up beyond pro forma reporting, much better now at dynamic predictive stuff. I'll show you some indicators for that. Used to be very much a local project by regulators country by country. Now, as we've just shown you through the previous slide, they're all talking to each other. There are global agreements on what is the fundamental of good behavior, good purpose, and so on. Treaties, memorandums of understanding, and so on. It was therefore in the past about command and control. It's now much more about what behavioral scientists refer to as direct observation, what I like to call what actually happens. Not what people say, not what the corporate version says, but the observed front line, what actually happens on a given day as people deal with customers or whatever. Part of that, they're attracting, the regulators are much more open to external sources, and we're going to talk about some of those in a second. Again, we've grown up beyond this idea that it's all about tone. So there's a famous Australian study that I was involved with getting on 10 years ago now, which shows that tone at the top is not itself the driver of corporate culture. It's a precondition for sure, but simply the board saying, oh, we've got to be better at culture has literally zero impact on frontline behavior change. That is so important to get our heads around. So if we want to get frontline behavior change, it's about the mid-levels, it's about all staff buy-in, you know, all this stuff. Not just saying, oh, well, the board talks about it and it'll be fine, because experience shows that really doesn't work. And this is one of the fundamentals I call the FCA on. SMCR has not worked. Okay. If we care about what the workforce thinks, there's plenty of primary evidence that the talent, you know, the average age of the workforce now is post-millennial. So people are born 1990 or later, if you want to call that definition of millennials. All the signs are that people in that demographic bracket are much more interested in workplace culture. They're less primarily interested in the financial reward package, and they want to work somewhere where they think people behave well here, we've got good D&I, and I'm rewarded for being useful as a member of society rather than just shifting lots of products. That is I'm not saying that those of us born in the last century didn't have any of these values, by the way, and I'm sure those gathered here this evening are all very sound on the ethical stuff, but there's a very clear generational shift that's gone on here, partly because the younger people coming into the workforce have had a pretty bad deal. You know, they're worse off than their parents. They've been stuck in their bed sits for the last 2 years, working on a laptop, you know, surrounded by smelly flatmates, and they're not going to be able to buy a house. That's 3 things for starters, which make them pretty unhappy with our so-called okay boomers. So, socially useful purpose, let's start with that. The theory is this, that banks are populated by evil people with a grand plan to defraud the public. Actually, tempting though it is to go along with that theory, I don't buy that. I buy this instead. Anyone like to spot a common theme between these 3 photo opportunities? So the first one is crossing the road against a red light because you can see there's no traffic coming. The second one, I'm not quite
Roger,
sure
are
what
you
the
going to
second one is.
suggest broken windows? The broken
Yeah,
windows.
it's a kind of, yeah, absolutely. I think you've got it, Dennis. It's little trivial signals that add up to something bigger. So let's just taxonomize this a little bit. Sorry, that's a bit of a RC academic word. Let's sort these into categories that we can all understand in plain language. Do as I say, not as I do. I think there's no better current example than the health secretary, or ex-health secretary. I used to use that other guy who went to Barnard Castle, but actually we now have an even better photo example of do as I say, not as I do. Let's look at some other ones. Just shut up and do it. Stupid seeming instructions. So my personal favorite is this one, the no smoking ashtray. You know, if I have a lit cigarette in my hand, I'm going to use this article. I'm not going to put it out. Mindless binary controls, you know, like the US immigration card that asks you, are you a terrorist, yes or no? You know, fantastic. I completely understand the legal process behind that, by the way. Let's get sidetracked by that. But asking a question which at surface level is clearly stupid is a great way to disengage people from any sort of control process. Shooting the messenger, I think we're all familiar with that. Arbitrary or fantasy sales targets, or so-called stretch goals. Moving deadlines around, making jokes about compliance, aggregating away inconvenient local data into a single bottom line figure that sort of says it's all okay. Giving forewarning of audits. Hey, everybody, you know, get your act together with the auditors are coming next week, so make the books look clean. And defending your team's special status. We're too busy selling stuff to bother talking to compliance staff right now. So these are the classic sort of top 10 or 11 patterns of behavior, which you can look. I've used no science language here at all. This is all just straightforward conversational stuff that you can pick up on. You know, you do not need a PhD in cognitive psychology to see that this is happening. So what does the regulator really want, making sense of all of those sorts of inputs? Well, really, this is the standing agenda that all financial regulators have. So there's nothing new in this first part. Consumer protection, market integrity. We know all that. What have they added, though, through the conduct project since the financial crisis? Well, these things. We want to see firms thinking intelligently. We want to see an expression of socially useful purpose. And we want to see that you are investing some effort in studying the mechanics of human behavior, whether you want to call that cognitive science, I don't really care. What is it that drives? What is it that motivates, demotivates, leads people off the rails to game the system? You know, or how much serious thought have you given to any of that stuff? Finally, the overlay is, and we're going to hold you personally responsible, not just your senior management functions, but actually everybody, including frontline staff. And I want to dig into that because I think this is a big step forward, potentially, which they could make far more of. It's being trialed in Singapore and Australia right now. I think serious improvement is possible using this technique, which I'll talk about in a second. Again, just to go to the underlay of regulatory speech making, there's been lots and lots of stuff coming out of the FCA, the New York Fed, and all sorts of places. What are the 3 steps we need to take? 1, set a clear, you know, stand on the mountaintop and consider why are you here in the world as a corporation. What you're here for is actually not rewarding your shareholders, it's providing a useful service, which as you do it, makes money, which then rewards the shareholders. But the shareholders are not the primary concern here. How about, let me just highlight some stuff here. Here are some utility definitions of valuable purpose. So you're a custodian of people's property, whether it's financial assets or their houses or whatever. You're a provider of credit as a utility supplier. You know, you turn on the light switch and you want the light bulb to come on. You turn on the tap, you want water to come out. You turn on the bank, you want credit and cash to come out. It's that sort of thinking. Supporting efficient markets, mediating between savers and borrowers, creating durable value. Now, all of those things are primary purposes. Not that many of them are actually things which companies put in their annual reports. Maybe they put it in their ESG, you know, somewhere in the lower paragraphs. Having defined the purpose, measure it, and benchmark it against the rest of the industry. We've got this thing called used to be the Banking Standards Board, now the Financial Services Culture Board. You know, not coincidentally, it's changed its name to include the word culture, which is maybe an exemplar of how we do benchmarking. I'm on the fence on this one, but we maybe take that at question time. When you've defined purpose and done a bit of benchmarking, then you check your behaviors are consistent with goals. There's a wonderful academic paper called On the Folly of Rewarding A Whilst Hoping for B. And I think it's a big problem in the industry that the rewards are still geared to how much quantity of stuff do you sell? How many boxes do you get out the door? How many PPI policies have you shoved out the door on an unsuspecting public, rather than what is the real customer benefit of anything that you're doing? So there's a wholesale rethink required on rewards. Some of it's happened, a lot of it hasn't. This is what I really wanted. This is the core of cultural audit, which I really wanted to get to. Some enlightened regulators, notably in Singapore, are doing this thing called the floor walk, which is they drop in to the offices of a financial firm and they literally do what it says on the tin. They walk around and they have random conversations with people in the front office, not the boardroom, not the back office, not the compliance people, the sales staff, the helpline staff, the customer-facing branch staff. And I love these questions, and I'm really happy to share them with you. So here's the first one. So remind me, Mr. or Ms. Counter staff, your firm's core, you did that core values training piece a couple of years ago, right? Can you remember any of the core values that the head of HR told you that you had, whether or not you actually have, you believe that you have? Can you remember them? And again, the regulator does this lovely thing. If there's a wall chart with the core values on, they will physically stand in front of the wall chart so that the person being interviewed can't cheat by reading it. So the first test is, can you actually remember any of that corporate stuff that we talked about in values training? And the killer question is not that one so much as the follow-up, which is this. Okay, so thanks, Mr. or Ms. whatever. Can you now show me a piece of work you are doing today, right here, right now, which is putting that value into practice? It can't be that difficult. If you've got the values, surely everything you're doing relates to that. So show me a thing you're doing now, which is doing that. Now, you won't be at all surprised to hear that as they're testing this, a lot of the time it meets with a sort of terrified rabbit in the headlights stare, because people are not thinking in this way. It is so simple to do this. It is so simple to think about these things, and yet intelligent thought is somehow forbidden in a lot of workplaces. Here's another question. When was the last time someone in your team put a hand up to challenge anything? Now, you can see where the follow-up question is going with this. It's not just, does it ever happen? And a lot of times it doesn't, by the way. The follow-up question, again, the killer question really is this bit. And what happened next? It's what I refer to as the what actually happens test. That's WAH. And Stephen and research colleagues are sick of me using the phrase what actually happens, but that's the plain language version of what is behavioral science for. Behavioral science is all about what actually happens, not the optimistic corporate version, the observed frontline version. So the hands up and challenge test is fascinating, not so much because do people or don't they put a hand up. Plenty of people put a hand up. Of the people who put a hand up, a very large proportion quite often get ignored. Some of them get fired, thrown out the window, thrown under the bus, because there is not engagement with intelligent questions or answering. So here's another one to senior people, to board people, to team leaders. What actually makes you think that you're competent and fit for your role? I know you qualified as a chartered accountant or whatever, with all deference to the chartered accountants here, but what have you done about keeping your knowledge fresh in the last 20 years since you got that certificate? What do you know about modern market practice? Do you participate in roundtables, trade associations, writing white papers, engaging in parliamentary committee responses, and so on? Do you actually care about your job, or are you just there for payday, essentially? And that applies at board level, at least as much as on the front line, and arguably it's more important at board level. In the background, like any good auditor, they're running a script about, so are the systems and controls really working? What's your attitude? When I ask you one of these core punchy questions, are you trying to get rid of me? Are you actually answering the question, or are you looking for the door to run away? And generally, what culture do I observe operating around me as I'm asking these questions in the workplace? Not, just to be clear, not in a nice compliance meeting where there's a few hand-picked people to answer prepared questions. This is real. This is going out to the front line and asking the actual salespeople, typically, what do you do day to day? So underlying the thought process is this idea of we've got to learn to keep ahead. So if you're serious about adopting this pattern of thinking, we need to know some basic human science stuff. None of this should surprise you, by the way. Your view of what is an acceptable risk is constantly changing. Everybody's view of what is an acceptable risk is constantly changing. Here is one of the dynamics behind that. I've just chosen the easiest one here. As you age, and we do a little test when I'm teaching this in banks. So is anyone's idea of a good night out now the same as it was when you were 17 years old? You know, if you want to go out partying and get blind drunk and throw up on the pavement, probably not, right? That's called growing up. And your view of risk-taking changes clearly as you grow up, as you get a responsible job, as you're surrounded by people in the workplace, we hope also with similarly responsible values, right? Let's port that across into a more social space. You know, the world is watching you. What do we need to do to look for signals on this stuff? Let's call it unstructured data. So this is not formal corporate reporting. This is just the world talking and observing you. Hey, guess what? I've just spent an hour with Andy talking about Violation Tracker. Here's a bunch of other places we can look. Yep, TTF is there. Glassdoor, Trustpilot, didtheyhelp.com, Edelman Barometer, the Ombudsman, parent groups, consumer groups, you know. The social media world is awash with these sources of unstructured information and critiques. How many companies pay any attention to that? So I'll tell you what, Violation Tracker's launching in 6 weeks' time. They're in for a hell of a shot if they haven't bothered to research that, you know. This is aggregating corporate misconduct at brand level, at parent company level, at super jurisdiction level. I think it's fantastic. And I think it's going to seriously shake up people's engagement with this so-called culture reporting that a lot of them are not actually doing. Okay. I mentioned earlier on the regulator is a great one for borrowing psychology textbooks. Here is some of the stuff that the UK regulator has said that they've essentially just written it on a post-it note and stuck it on the wall, but let me share it with you anyway. People like to maintain self-image of being a moral person. So most junior staff, when they arrive at work, want to feel they're doing something useful. The problem with corporate structures, particularly compliance reporting, it's a rather threatening sort of demeanor, and it tends to make people frightened of putting a hand up and asking an intelligent question. I agree with that. Reduce the remoteness of rule breaking, this idea that consequences are for other people, you know, consequences are for the birds, we can just get on with selling stuff. I agree with that. And finally, reduce ambiguity. You know, so the average board pack, I was talking to the board of a high street bank just this afternoon, they're saying their board pack, their quarterly, get this, board packs are, how many hundreds of pages, anyone? How many 100 pages is a quarterly board pack in a UK high street bank? You want to take a guess? Get this, 2,000 pages. Nobody's going to read that. Come on, guys. Be sensible. Hire a company secretary who is a qualified professional who can edit that down to something that is actually readable, doesn't give you brain ache, you know, simply when you receive it. Reduce cognitive burdens, make it easier to engage with processes. That'll really help. So I do agree with some of that stuff, even if the science they're quoting is not always quite on point. Here's the thing, all boards are used to using these kinds of indicators, but hey, they all measure money. Last time I looked, money is a hopeless measure for human behavior. Money is just, you know, lumps of stuff sitting in an account or blips transacting through markets. It doesn't read what people are actually doing. This is what reads what people are actually doing. You know, how helpful are we? How engaging are we? How much do we talk to people? And by the way, I absolutely understand those are rather weird jargon terms, but at least one of them you'll see rings a bell. Moral courage, quality of leadership. I think we can all agree that moral courage, although it's quite a Victorian sounding phrase, has a really important resonance here and is clearly something we should measure. Let's find a measure for it. Let's report it. You know, is this business managed by people who run away when things go wrong or who step up and solve the problem, particularly at the customer end? Another project I've done, this is with UK Finance, is we took the 5 conduct questions, which are written in hopelessly legalese jargon, a lot of them, and translated them into English. So here are the 5 conduct questions rendered into plain English in a way that every member of staff on the front line can understand. What do I do to check no one's behaving badly? And so I won't read this out. You get the gist of it. We've tried to keep them to as far as possible words of 1 or 2 syllables, not always successfully. You're aware, I'm sure, there's a 6th conduct question about diversity and inclusion that's coming out shortly. That's fantastic, and there are good reasons for that, which we'll come on to in just a second. Yeah, by the way, let's not just go to academia. Let's talk to people who understand consumer behavior. This one is one of my favorites, David Ogilvy, the Madison Avenue guy from the 50s. People don't think how they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. So he's saying consumers are actually quite an unreliable proxy quite often for understanding human behavior. Here's the behavioral scientist Dan Ariely. If you want to really understand what people do and what they say they're doing, we've got to be relentlessly empirical. Again, just to translate that, look for what actually happens, not what people say at corporate level or even as consumers. Look at the decisions they actually take, not about, recommend, oh, of course I'd recommend the brand to a friend. Do they really? I bet they don't. So we've got to have a different kind of data gathering to get at this stuff. Everyone is used to doing staff sentiment surveys. Almost nobody is doing actual observed behavior tracking. They are not the same thing. Staff sentiment surveys, which typically ask these cheesy motherhood and apple pie questions. How do you feel? What do you want? What would I like to believe about the values applying? Okay, fine. That expresses isolated individual states of mind. It's sort of individual. It may or may not indicate actual engagement. Tell you what indicates actual engagement, this. What really happens? What actually happens when somebody puts a hand up and gets slapped down? Tell you what happens, they go and get a job with a better employer. Or worse, they stick around and sabotage things. Look for observed behavior, not what people say they do. What they say they do is often wrong. It's either mistaken or, because they're not psychologists, or it's a white lie, or it's actually not a white lie. It's concealing the fact that they're doing something they don't feel good about. Look for what actually happens. I'm not going to go through all the next slide, and apologies, this is really quite technical, but some of this stuff, think of this as a flashcard. I'm trying to reduce these things into the plainest possible language, not always succeeding. Let's talk about virtues and vices rather than good conduct and misconduct. Here's just a little sort box of some of the indicators that we might populate under that. So fairly obviously, hopefully you're seeing the cursor here. Psychological safety, that's an idea we can probably buy into without too much difficulty. Is it okay to put a hand up? Opposite of psychological safety is abusive behavior. Opposite of moral courage is bystander, hoping somebody else will fix the problem. And so on and so on. And I won't go through all this because it's quite a busy slide, but we use this in training at the Academy and it gets quite a strong reaction. So look, first off, a lot of the stuff you need to observe culture and behavior is already there. So these are all things which are already there. MBWA is management by wandering about, meaning do senior people get up off their asses out of the corner office and go and say hello to people on the front desk and actually have a human conversation rather than a, don't mind me, I'm the chairman type conversation. So they have human interaction with junior staff on a regular basis and gather anecdotes from those interactions. If you want to go upscale, hey, look, I'm your man. There's loads of this bought-in indicator stuff. I'll talk briefly about some of these scales. There's tons of academic output, very little of which, by the way, the regulator seems to have engaged with. Some of this stuff is great, some of it's rubbish. I'm not going to tell you necessarily which is which today, but there's plenty you can buy in if what you want to do is get a black box to do these analytics for you. There are 2 indicators which are head and shoulders above the rest. These are cognitive diversity, that is the ability to, solve problems by drawing on diverse thinking, and psychological safety, is it okay to put a hand up and ask an intelligent challenge question? Where those factors are present, staff retention, customer retention, funds under management, innovation, business resilience, all these things are the trade-offs. So why the hell wouldn't you do this? It's good for business, never mind what the regulator says. If you're interested, I've published another book on this called The Behavioral Lens, which I think I flagged in the bio piece. So the challenge function, here's just a quick bit of academic output that shows the benefits of that. It's generative. It shows that you have curious, experimental, inquiring, nurturing mindset. So what's not to like in that? Quick flash through. I'm really conscious that I need to start talking in a minute to allow some questions. So, psychological safety, you may be aware a lot of conduct regulations have bought into this in a big way in the last couple of years. Again, COVID going on has given this quite a lift. Here's Amy Edmondson, the Harvard professor, who talks about this. How do we define psychological safety? Here's some read across. So red is bad, green is good, using some risk language. So let's just get a couple of examples. A boss should not be a person who gives orders or judges performance, but somebody who invites contributions to make improvement, and somebody who creates conditions for continued learning. These are some of the reframes that we use in psychological safety to work through. And hopefully it's not just words, it's attitude, it's lived behavior, observed behavior, and so on. You know, so destigmatizing failure is a big part of this, not criticizing people for making honest mistakes. Let's also quickly look at cognitive diversity. And hey, look, here's the FCA. They read Matthew Syed's book. They've written a paper, which is great. Let me just do a quick run through Matthew Syed. If you haven't read Matthew Syed's book, Rebel Ideas, it's fantastic. It covers all this really well. Here are some diversity types, which some firms are using as indicators. Actually, we need to look further and higher than that and go cognitive, which is a bigger thing. A quick map of cognitive diversity. Here is what leaders think is happening. Hey, look, we're hiring all these diverse people in the problem-solving space. That's the box. The box is, you know, stuff that we're trying to make better. It's problem-solving. What actually happens? Again, guess what? Observed behavior. People get crushed into the corner because they're so busy copying the leader. We hire diversity and then we crush the diversity out of people because of threats about compliance, because everyone's group thinking, following the leader, whatever, you know. Syed, I've just given you the citation at the bottom there, is brilliant on this, and I recommend you to him. By the way, if you have diverse thinking, there is absolute, you know, cast iron evidence that this improves problem solving, and there's clearly a dividend to customer care from that. So, right, let me wrap up and stop talking now. There's lots and lots and lots of out there MI. Some of it's really technical, some of it's actually rather fun. I've been researching this last week, a thing called sludge audits. There's also a first cousin of that called the bullshit audit, forgive the phrase, but it's a hugely effective tool. So, you know, you don't have to go top scale academia to find stuff that works to solve these problems. One of my favorite ones, the Google search, really try this later this evening, or try it now, if you've got a spare screen. Type in the phrase, why did, and then your favorite brand. So I just did this for Boris Johnson because it's funny. And look what Google returns. So Google will tell you what is the public concerned about in your brand space. So if you're Boris Johnson this evening, I'm fascinated by why did Boris Johnson hide in a fridge? why did Boris Johnson renounce America? You know, this is an instant readout of public opinion about what your brand is doing wrong, and it's free. Literally, type in the phrase "why did" and the brand and see what comes out. Okay, I appreciate that's an easy one. Here's a slightly more upscale one. This is a particular, how should we say, fixation of one of the research teams at the FCA at the moment. It's actually based on ancient Greek philosophy and a nod towards Socrates. The presence or absence of virtues and the balance of virtues in making people suitably thoughtful and mindful. Again, I'll give you the citation if you want to read the whole paper behind that. I prefer to, rather than banging on about Socrates, let's use a phrase that everyone can get on board with: better questions. Ask better questions. Get everybody asking better questions, especially bottom up. Front-facing customer service people know what's happening. Who is the world's richest man right now? I'm pretty sure it's Jeff Bezos. How did Jeff Bezos get to be the world's richest man? Well, one of the things he does is he gathers anecdotes. He regularly walks the floor in Amazon warehouses and fulfillment centers and you know, tech centers, and does these frontline conversations with frontline staff and just asks them plain questions. How's it going? What's going wrong? What do we need to fix? Not, you know, hello, I'm the chairman. Just, hey, Andy, how's it going? What's gone wrong today that you think I should know? And what Bezos says is, and this is really good, when the risk analysis and the anecdotes disagree, so when the formal risk analysis is saying something different from what the anecdotes say, what do? I go and get more anecdotes because they're more useful. They're more real. Risk analysis is typically 3 months, 6 months, 12 months behind the problem. The anecdotes tell you, a bit like the Google search, tell you what's happening today on the front line. So, better questions. How do we objectively measure what actually happens? Not sentiment analysis, forget that. What actually happens? How do we track external changes in public expectations of good behavior, good conduct? Do we ever discuss exemplary? Are we so fixated about conduct risk infraction reporting that we miss the far more important point about exemplary conduct? What's good that's going to draw people towards good? Never mind running away from bad. Okay, if you care about any of what I've said in the last half an hour, please read the book, because there's lots more where that comes from. There's a bunch of other books which I would aspire to be in the company of. Some of them are very, very good. Syed, I've talked about a lot. Rebel Ideas, fantastic. It's a New York Times bestseller, deservedly. Here's my previous book about behavior analysis. Here's a little book about behavior and biases. Here's a very heavyweight, this is quite niche, but it's very good indeed, from my Oxford colleagues, Chris Hodges and Ruth Steinholtz, by the way, who've also written the Culture Audit book for me, bless them, all about relationships with regulators in all the major sectors. By the way, banking's relationship with its regulator is consistently one of the worst.
Really?
And I'll leave you with that thought.
What a masterclass. That was so enjoyable and so informative. I really enjoyed every second of that. That was absolutely first class, Roger. It really was. I'm absolutely sure that all of my all of our attendees will feel exactly the same way. Before we do anything else, folks, let's please take a moment to just thank Roger for that first class masterclass that he just shared with us. That really was especially good, Roger. First chance we get, we're going to have you presenting.
How can I do 20 years of work in 30 minutes?
Right. You did a great job. First chance, Roger, we'll get you speaking to a much larger group at one of our events about culture. That'd be, I really enjoy that. Really enjoy that. I can see that everyone else has as well, which is wonderful.
I'm conscious of Stephen on the line, who's a close critic of all this, so I'm hoping you'll have some counterpoints to make.
Well, why don't we go? Why don't we go to Stephen first of all? So, Stephen, please share your thoughts, your insights, your response to what Roger has just set out. Thank you.
This is fairly easy. So, in brief, I would just say I agree. Roger knows more about this than most people out there. And he benefits by being informed with the advice and guidance from all the different people whose thoughts he gathers in his terrific books. My own meager thinking, the one exception perhaps, is to what's useful.
Stephen, your chapter on the cool kids problem is exemplary. I have to say, it's worth the price of the book for that alone.
Thank you for that.
I'm not just saying that; it's a great piece of work.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Roger. Look, I have become, atypically for me, I mean, Roger knows me to be fairly jolly. I've become a bit dour and cynical in the last 6 months. And I'll offer three reasons for that. Let's start with Australia. The Hayne Commission uncovered just shed loads of misconduct in the banking sector. There was great hue and cry. A couple of heads rolled. There was promise of dramatic regulatory change from both ASIC and APRA, which all was pushed to the back burner by COVID. The Morrison government and Treasurer Josh Fryberg, to my mind, breathed a great sigh of relief that they didn't have to worry about this crap any longer, because everyone is distracted by COVID. And now that they're somewhat coming out of COVID, you'd think that the government would be returning to this agenda, and they've shown absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. And in fact, what's come out most recently from the chairman of the board of ASIC, statements from APRA and statements from the treasurer, is we really need the regulators to support economic recovery. So the regulators are supposed to be driving economic recovery rather than making sure it takes place in a way that is in keeping with rules and regulations. So if that's not capture, I'm not sure what is.
Yeah. I'd say I do a chapter on capture in my previous book about conduct risk assessment. So yeah, very big topic.
So the capture issue is a big issue. Second issue that I'd point to that has me dour of late is culture fatigue. The FCA has been at the fore among all of its international peers. A tip of the hat to the DNB for showing how to think about this stuff, but that came from relatively low down in the Dutch central bank. It was popularized by those who care about this stuff, but even within the DNB, when I met with the head of that department who did the preamble to our annual compendium report last year, he was thanking me for popularizing his ideas because he had heard from the supervisory board of the DNB that, oh, we're doing some interesting stuff here. So at the top level, no one really knew what was going on. Where there was a different tenor, however, was at the FCA. The FCA really seemed to have got this stuff and they were pressing for it until the recent change of guard. And to my mind, and I think this came through in the talk that we had last week with Nick Morathi, the FCA is completely off the plot. They have correlated diversity and inclusion with good culture. And when they talk about diversity and inclusion, they don't talk about inclusion. They talk about diversity. And when they talk about diversity, they only talk about more pink, less blue. So I don't know if pink washing is a term of art, but I actually have contributing to our compendium in this coming year, the professor of finance at the Norwegian School of Economics, which is an advisor to the Norwegian Sovereign Fund. And she points out that Norway was the first country to mandate that firms had to have 40% women on their boards and in management. And as the FCA has emphasized, countless studies show that companies with more women outperform their peers. They don't name the studies. Countless studies show that firms with more women in leadership have lower conduct risk. Again, they don't name the studies. And in fact, I know the studies, and when you look at them, there are as many studies that say there's absolutely no relationship as studies that say there is a relationship. Yeah. There's the usual inflation of correlation and causality.
Yeah.
And
there's a weak correlation and zero causation. I think there's a meta study that's essentially showing us just
there's more and more studies coming out saying that it's basically hogwash. And what this woman in Norway has said is, in their own analysis of what transpired in terms of value creation or destruction among firms after they implemented this dramatic change, and the answer was no effect whatsoever. Right. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have women in positions of leadership. Let's just say that we value that as a society. We think that firms should reflect the societies that host them. That's a value, and enough said. But that's not what the FCA is doing. What the FCA is doing is they're using diversity as a divining rod, and they're saying where we don't see an appropriate number of women, I don't know how we define what appropriate is, but they'll come up with a metric. And where we don't see that, we view that as the tip of an iceberg, and we'll assume there are greater cultural problems, and therefore we'll give closer regulatory scrutiny. Now, all of this sounds to me like they're just throwing a bone to the woke generation. And investors don't give a toss. And to the extent that they care because, it's like saying we should abolish slavery because it's been demonstrated to produce greater shareholder returns. Well, how about we abolish slavery just because we think it's wrong, right? And so to the extent that investors care, they care because it represents their values. So why are we couching this in arguments of value, which are profoundly spurious?
Wow.
So I think the FCA is just completely barking up the wrong tree. I think it's largely window dressing, and I'm hopeful that Mel Stride and others will call them out on it.
Stephen, let me give you a 10-second answer to what was a very rounded and good point. Thank you. As a former lobbyist for the other side, hence I know perhaps where I speak on this. It's pretty clear that framing the argument as business first and then sort of moral compliance stuff second is designed to catch the attention of finance directors, of resource allocators in the industry. It's deeply cynical.
Well, what a rich conversation, Stephen. That was fascinating. Quick question for Stephen, if I may. Given the FCA is where you believe it is, and I think you're right, by the way, but given the FCA is where you believe it is, what could be done? I mean, how on earth do you stop it going down what looks like the wrong path?
So I said I had three sources of malaise. One was culture fatigue, and I used the FCA. The other was people just not caring in Australia. But the third reason I was going to offer you, I think is true in the US, and I think it's true in the UK, and I think it's just true generally speaking, and it gets to this point. I think that regulators and firms have reached a tacit agreement that human behavior is just so mysterious. There's just no ability to predict it. I mean, Jamie Dimon once said, if we have 270,000 employees, if we were a town, we'd have a jail. So the best that we can do is set aside contingent budget for the inevitable fines, because someone's going to do some dumb thing. We're going to get fined for it. We know that. We're going to have shareholder lawsuits. We know that. We'll have customer remediation costs. We know that. So let's budget it as contingent budget. We release that in our financial disclosures. If the proverbial shit hits the fan, then we've already got it covered. And if not, then we can dividend those monies back out to our shareholders. And that's it, job done. So effectively, misconduct will happen and is priced in. And because it is priced in, there is truly nothing more to be done.
Jeez.
So the more pointed answer to your question, Andy, what we are doing in the US is we're engaging with Congress. We hope to engage with Parliament in the UK. We are engaged with the Senate in Australia. And we're advancing the argument that this idea that the best we can do is have surveillance and monitoring so we catch bad actors in the act and then take corrective action. We call that the detect and correct mindset, is a really crap standard of care. And if you think about nuclear power, right, detect and correct. When there's a meltdown, an alarm goes off and we'll send in the cleanup crew, and with a 50,000 year half-life for radiation, everything should be fine in 100,000 years.
Contrast aviation with blame-free risk reporting. Contrast in the UK also food safety, blame-free. The new food safety controls reward firms that call themselves out, that have full transparency. It's a totally different mindset.
Precisely.
Finance is not even in the same century.
That's right. So we've been advancing the argument that rather than detect and correct, what's needed as a standard of care is predict and prevent. And the argument that predict and prevent is not possible, because how do you predict human behavior? We would argue is completely facile and demonstrably untrue. Because if you look at what banks do, they use a predictive engine to anticipate whether Roger Miles will repay his mortgage. And based on that, they calculate how much they should lend and at what price. They will have predictive engines that will seek to anticipate whether Dennis O'Connor will respond to a targeted advertisement for Beer Guzzlers magazine versus Chardonnay Sippers magazine, and they target their ad spend that much more effectively. They will use predictive technologies to anticipate whether Kim Schweitzer is going to act in a certain way based on market movements, so that they can position their portfolio accordingly. So they're using predictive technologies that gauge the likelihood of human behavior outside the organization.
Let's not forget sell instructions.
Right.
Talking of algo trading, it's all behavioral.
Yeah. So they use predictive technology to anticipate human behavior in everything that they do to make money. Yeah. But then when you ask them to use those same sorts of technologies to look inward, they say, oh, that can't be done.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating. Well, this is such a rich conversation. It really is. Stephen, thank you so much. Mr. Dennis O'Connor, then we'll go to Kim, then we'll go to Nigel. Dennis.
Lots of questions, but I'll throw in a few things. You mentioned the Banking Standards Board. They refuse to publish their discrete reports on culture within each bank, the self-assessment of culture.
Luckily, I've done the rounds of most of the participating banks, and I've seen those reports, although for obvious reasons I can't share them with you.
But they refuse to publish them to the public. Just to let you know, Roger and I conversed earlier this year about the Bank of England working paper on observed events, not incidents, events. Mm-hmm. Very mathematical. Bank of England concludes, since 2013, the culture of the banks has not changed overall.
Mm.
I think there was some, shall we say, deterministic sampling going on there as well.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
That's maybe a separate conversation.
Senior management hasn't worked. I throw two examples in. The review of the APP code and how that's working, and that's not working well. And the recent Dear CEO letter on money laundering in retail banks, getting the basics wrong after 30 years. But one question, which I asked at an event a few years ago, I never got a satisfactory answer. You guys will know better than me that corporate behaviour has been studied since the 1970s on an academic basis, and repeated papers show the more ethical an organisation is, the better financial returns. Why did banks only take up the ideas of having a good culture post the financial crisis if they could have generated superior returns beforehand anyway?
Let me answer that with a very quick counterpoint. There is inconvenient research that shows that sociopaths, so people who are empathy deficient, in the short term make more money. So let's just translate that into English, as I like to. Hit and run selling is productive in the short term. Unfortunately, in the long term, it destroys value, but we don't care because we're off somewhere else.
We've moved on. Yeah.
So does that, let me come in there if I may, does that point to a failure for our reward incentive programs to actually reward appropriately? One of the points I found Roger made to be very interesting was the idea of we want X, but we actually reward Y. So yes. our reward strategies should be aligned to the individual within the organization adding value in the medium to long term. If our reward programs incentivize short-term behavior, hit and run selling, sorry, then that's what we're going to get. There's that wonderful Charlie Munger quote. I use it at least once a week. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And I remember in the 1990s, a company called Clerical Medical, they had a sales force called Provision, and they developed a really progressive reward program. There were no bonuses based on productivity. The bonus structure was all about client satisfaction ratings. And they tried for as long as they could to make that work. And eventually, the financial pressures on the organization, as I interpret what was going on, actually got it to change that and ended up with a more traditional mindset. So I think reward and how we incentivize people has got to be at the heart of a lot of this stuff.
Andy, very quick point, just to come back on that. And again, Stephen, you'll recognize this from your work with the American markets, that short-termism versus genuine, the system of government we have is inherently short-termist. We have a 5-year electoral cycle, which discourages people from thinking about long-term tough problems, really most obviously climate change. You have an electoral cycle that effectively stops people from thinking about that because it's 5 years away and I'll be gone by then. Exactly the same thing in corporate boardrooms. It's not even the annual reporting cycle, it's the quarterly reporting, dividends, whatever cycle. Why would anyone think long-term if everything is geared to a 3-monthly view?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Kim, to you.
And that's what I was going to say. We're sitting here saying that it's a failure of our incentive programs and that we're not incentivizing what we actually want people to do. What we want is X, but we're incentivizing Y. I would say no. What we want is X and what we're getting is X, because what we want is the financial returns. So, it's only been recently when we're really been talking about stakeholder capitalism and people, planet, and profit, not just profit. Because in the past and for many, many years, and what's written in the corporations in the US is all about, what's the definition of a corporation, right? It's all about the shareholders. So I think we are incentivizing what we really want. And Roger, you hit it on the head. If you've got to go out with quarterly reports, every quarter, you've got to be showing that you're moving towards or meeting those quarterly objectives so that you can meet your annual objectives and you meet your, promises to shareholders, investors. So we're incentivizing what we want.
So Kim, let me give you a quick
Only
example.
been recently. Yeah.
Sorry, a really quick example of where this leads us astray, seriously for the long term. Pure research.
It's all short-termism.
Any business that is in the business, arguably, of pure research, most obviously big pharma or agriculture, whatever, sectors where investment in pure research you would have thought is the absolute engine of long-term value, are not spending money on pure research. It's all applied, cheese paring.
Yeah, it's sad, isn't it?
So what's going to break that cycle? Because this is actually quite worrying, Kim. What you're saying is, in actual fact, the reward systems in place are the right reward systems for what society appears to want its organizations to do, which is to maximize profit in the short term.
No, I'm saying that that's not necessarily what society wants, but that's what the business wants. So I'm not saying that that's,
okay.
If you take society, right? I'm saying that's what the business wants. They're incentivizing for what they want. And, 2 years ago, it was about a little over 2 years ago when the Business Roundtable came out and, talked about stakeholder capitalism.
Yeah.
You can look at the behaviors of all of those organizations, and actually there's going to be another LBS webinar coming up on stakeholder capitalism with Alex Edmonds and Lucian Bebchuk. And it's supposed to be a big debate. They both believe in stakeholder capitalism. Alex comes at it from the intrinsic nature, and Lucian comes at it through regulation. And, over the last 2 years, the question is, has anything really changed? And there's, you get arguments on both sides. No, nothing's changed. Yes, there have been changes. And if there have been changes, it's been incremental. It hasn't been this big thing that, the stakeholder capitalism was really going to take hold after the Business Roundtable came out.
You're right.
I just post back one more. I think there is a generational shift, which is going to be quite interesting. And I think just as the old model of high street banking is going to implode at some point under the pressure of the challengers, because, if you tried using Monzo, for example, compared with the old style engagement with your bank, it's just clearly better designed.
Definitely going to be a generational shift.
There is a generational shift, and I think it's just this inexorable pressure of demographics that as the workforce gets younger or gets post-millennial, whatever you want to call it, increasingly people are going to say, what are we doing here? Actually just making money is not okay. Much though we like money, there is other stuff that we care about.
And I'm confused.
I honestly do believe that's a thing.
I'm confused by the FCA and their part in this, because on one hand, listening to what you guys were talking about, it seems like they're on the forefront. And yet, if you look at their own internal culture, I think people who work for the FCA would say that, how can they be judging others when they can't judge their own?
Wow.
Where's the real thought leadership on this coming from? The Netherlands always has. Since the early 90s, they've been way ahead of everybody else. The problem is they're a small country. They're not a major financial market, by global definitions. And as Stephen says, rather sadly, the people doing the thinking aren't even too necessarily in their own country.
Wow. Really interesting. We'll go to Nigel, then we'll go to Roger to share his final thoughts, then we'll bring things to a close. This has got to be one of the most interesting sessions we've ever run. Nigel, to you, sir.
Thank you. Well, firstly, just to pick up on Roger's point about horizons and the how forward-looking governments are in policy, and the FCA and the different factions that tend to be governed by different parameters. It seems it's become apparent to me in the past sort of couple of months or so that everybody's horizon at the moment is fundamentally being governed by when the Fed is going to start tapering. And the massive economic global changes that are going to emanate from that, and the policies that the big financial institutions are gearing up to cope with that, are 99.9% of their focus at the moment. Whilst at the same time, we can see that a lot of big organizations and banks are engaging with their own versions of culture clubs. There was one I sent to Andy recently, where they're all saying the right things. They've employed the right people to say, yes, this is what we must be doing. But I think so much of that is presentational and actually just very cynically factored in to appear to be doing the right things and keeping the lid on, the relevant government departments, the Treasury saying the right things that John Glenn wants to hear at the moment. So his presentation of how he's succeeded in his current role will look good. And it's all massaging. I was particularly interested in following up on another point that you made earlier on, because I couldn't afford your book. I read the rather voluminous accolades that come on Amazon recommending the book. And one of the last ones is from the FCA. And
funny that.
Yeah, I don't know why it was last, but I was very interested to read its content as well. And I thought, whoever's saying this, no, not the FCA, sorry, UK Finance I'm talking about. The FCA did put one in, but UK Finance in particular. And when I was reading it, I thought, whoever's writing this is smiling through gritted teeth and saying what, we think we ought to say in these circumstances. But I can imagine them being very irritated by a lot of the content of your book. And for obvious reasons, because it's all about the money. Another thing I wanted to just comment on was empathy deficiency. Now, it became obvious to me some years ago that the banks deliberately psychoanalyze their applicants, and they've got the choice of all the top guys from Oxford and Cambridge and what have you, and they've got a very long list of people with first-class honours degree wanting to join the bank. So they get them all to take a psychometric test to make sure that apart from being really bright, they're also empathetically deficient in order to be able to achieve the proper purpose of the banks, which is, in my opinion, firstly and primarily to fill their own pockets and through peer pressure to toe the line so that they all get big banker bonuses, and then lip service to the shareholders afterwards. And then further and further down the pecking order, you've got whole departments that manage complaints from the government, manage complaints from MPs on behalf of constituents. But it's all very, very well managed, but extremely cynical. And just my final point, bearing that in mind, you see my viewpoint, is that the latest initiative of the FCA, instead of a duty of care, seems to be that, oh, well, what we've got to do is say to all these empathetically deficient people that have been hand-picked to work in financial services, oh, what you've got to do is put yourself in the shoes of the consumer. And you've got to look into your empathetic self to identify with these people. Well, that's diametrically opposed to what they've always been trained to do. and the very character of the people that have been chosen in the first place. So it seems to me that's got zero chance of success, and the FCA will know that.
Nigel,
Okay, I'll shut up.
Nigel, you raise lots of very interesting points. Does anybody have anything they're itching to say before we pass back to Roger for his final comments and wrap up? What a really fascinating session we've had. It's been a real treat. I've enjoyed every moment. Mr. Roger Miles, back to you, sir.
Thanks, Andy. So let's just pick up a few threads of the discussion and wind up. Nigel, yeah, you may be surprised here. I agree with most of that. I think Stephen and I have been corresponding recently on this thing called the normalization of deviancy, which is a huge theory that came through. If you're interested, there's a great book on the Challenger disaster and how the normalization of misreporting of engineering risk at NASA effectively set up the disaster to happen. There's regulatory capture. This is another topic which at least three, possibly all of us are corresponding on in various different forums. I wrote a paper for Reuters on regulatory capture back in about 2012. And lo and behold, all the preconditions kicked in, and this is a thing. So again, I won't dwell on the detail of that. What I've been doing recently,
I've actually recently experienced that myself, regulatory capture in my own case.
It's a thing.
Not that I'll expand on it now, but I'm very clear.
It's a thing. I mean, I can tell you reliably there are 6 preconditions for regulatory capture. The banking market absolutely has them all in spades, but we could look at other markets as well. Anyway, what I've been doing to try and encourage frontline people to engage with this a bit more, to try and create a bit more of a groundswell of asking intelligent questions and not being shot down, is running behavioral lens exercises post-COVID, saying to people, okay, what are the 3 public opinion things that are going to hit us, that are going to blow up confidence in the system again? And can we really give some serious thought to addressing those? So I'll tell you what the top 3 are. 1, who pays for COVID? This is a problem that all governments are facing, that clearly, Rishi Sunak faces. There's going to be some serious stress in the banking system and in personal finance generally around the tax bill, around raids on savings, around the impacts on pensions and house prices and domestic budgets, everything. Where does the banking system stand on that? Is it with the customers or is it with some other thing? Have you engaged with any of that yet? Answer, not a lot. Next. And we touched on this. I think, Dennis, you touched on this, and Stephen, I know we've talked again. Inflation and central bank base rates. Inexorably, there are going to be base rate rises. So add that to what I just said about domestic budgets. And by the way, in the UK, we've got an energy price crisis that's killing the sector right now. This is only going to get worse. And thirdly, this is the one which really hit home most for the banks. All the stuff that they said about being helpful during COVID, and let's be fair, a lot of it was genuinely, I hate the phrase tough decisions, but they really did, a lot of them, make serious efforts. Lots of good stuff going on at branch level, interestingly, not so much at corporate level, to make things better for suffering, vulnerable local populations. But a lot of phrases that came through from that, I think, are now going to be held up for re-exam. So let me just give you the phrase mortgage holiday or payment holiday. Imagine you're not inside the system and you hear that phrase mortgage holiday. What does that mean? That means your bank's giving you a free pass on your mortgage payments. Wait a minute, put yourself back inside the system. Of course it's not. It's the exact opposite. It's rolling up the loan and adding interest at the back end of it. So it's the exact opposite of the thing that you think it was. So now I'm not a mathematician, I'm a language analyst. Actually, that's where I started way back 40 years ago. The way that we describe things, the stories we tell, the sense that people make of what's going on often sets up the system to fail public confidence. And that's just such a simple example of a statement that's been made by the system. Oh, we'll give you a break, we'll give you a holiday. No, you're not. You're just rolling it up and charging more later, which is the exact opposite of what people think is happening. Now, okay, a lot of customers are not naive, but an awful lot of them are, or want to believe that it's something better than it is. And I see no sign of, the industry engaging with that. So those are my 3 sort of top tips for how the wheels are going to fall off next year. assuming that we survive this one. So you'd love me to end on an up note. I'm not though, so sorry. I see nothing but trouble.
Well, thank you so much. I think you're right to see nothing but trouble. I think there really are some very deep-rooted issues in the world of commerce generally that seem to be quite accentuated in the world of financial services specifically. I think there are some inherent characteristics of the financial services industry. In other words, we're dealing with intangible products that may or may not be right for the consumer and may take decades before you realize they're wrong for you. Whereas if you bought, let's say, a lawnmower, it didn't work properly, you take it to the shop, you get your money back. It's really relatively straightforward. I think there are some inherent characteristics of the financial services sector that mean it is always going to be challenged to behave properly, because it's so easy to get away with doing all sorts of shyster stuff for decades. And some individuals and some organizations have been doing that. Clearly, there's one thing we all agree on, and that's that culture is a key element in either getting it very, very right or getting it very, very wrong. And I'm absolutely convinced on a personal level that very closely linked to culture is the actual true inner integrity, the moral quotient, if you like, of the people at the apex of these organizations, not just the commercial side of the industry, but also the apex of the regulatory framework, the policy making framework, the government framework. Leadership's got to play a big part in all this as well. Roger, I thank you very much indeed for opening up my eyes to many, many things tonight that I didn't know much about at all. It's been a real pleasure listening to you. All the best with your book. Everyone should go out and buy it, especially if you're running a regulator. That's what I think anyway. Can we please show our appreciation to Roger for an outstandingly interesting TTF Book Club session? Very, very good indeed. Thank you very much. Folks, we'll wrap it up there. Have a good night. Thank you very much.
See you all soon.